On February 26, 2022, just 48 hours after Russian forces crossed into Ukraine, the United States and the European Union executed a financial maneuver that reshaped the global economic landscape in a way few fully understood at the time. They declared that Russian institutions would be disconnected from SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, a communications backbone linking more than 11,000 banks across roughly 200 nations and enabling about $5 trillion worth of daily transactional messaging. Because SWIFT is the universal language banks use to authorize payments, this move instantly severed Russia's ability to conduct routine international transfers, access trade finance, or settle cross-border obligations. In Washington and Brussels, this was hailed as the financial equivalent of launching a nuclear strike. Analysts predicted the ruble would collapse permanently, Russian commerce would disintegrate, and political pressure inside Russia would force immediate capitulation. Yet 2.5 years later, the outcome looked nothing like those early forecasts. The Russian currency regained stability, domestic controls were tightened, and global trade flows simply rerouted around Western infrastructure. More significantly, dozens of governments, many not aligned with Russia at all, watched what happened and reached the same sobering conclusion. If the United States could exclude Russia from the world's core financial arteries for geopolitical reasons, then no country was truly safe. That realization ignited a worldwide search for alternatives, and the consequences are still accelerating. What happened in 2022 was not unprecedented. Over the past century, dominant powers have weaponized financial systems 4 separate times, and every instance followed the same recognizable progression. A hegemon uses its command over financial networks to punish adversaries. The targets innovate or substitute away from the dominant system. Neutral countries quietly follow suit to avoid being trapped, and the very act of weaponization undermines the authority that made the system powerful in the first place. The pattern is predictable, and so are its effects. The more aggressively a financial tool is used as a geopolitical weapon, the faster its global credibility erodes. Before examining how this played out with SWIFT, it is essential to understand what SWIFT actually does. SWIFT is not a bank, does not store capital, and does not route money. It is a secure communication protocol, a standardized language that allows one financial institution to notify another that funds should move. A bank in New York might message a bank in Tokyo confirming authorization for a $1 million transfer, but the funds themselves move through correspondent accounts. SWIFT merely ensures the instructions are transmitted accurately, securely, and globally. Introduced in 1973 by 239 banks across 15 countries as a modernization of slow, unreliable telex communication, SWIFT rapidly became the backbone of the world's financial nervous system. By 1977, it carried 10 million messages a year. By 2024, it processed more than 11 billion messages annually, roughly 45 million each day. Its reach, speed, and standardization turned it into the indispensable conduit of international commerce. Although headquartered in Belgium, SWIFT's strategic vulnerability lies in the dominance of the United States dollar. Because the overwhelming majority of international transactions ultimately clear through United States correspondent banks in New York, Washington can pressure SWIFT to expel institutions and can cut banks off from dollar networks. Removal from SWIFT effectively places a country outside the global economy. The United States exercised this leverage in 2012 when Iranian banks were removed from the network. The consequences for Iran were severe. Oil revenue plummeted, inflation soared above 40%, and the economy contracted sharply, eventually compelling Tehran to enter negotiations that resulted in the 2015 nuclear agreement. The West saw this as proof that financial sanctions were decisive. But while the tactic achieved short-term results, it also taught Iran that dependence on SWIFT and the dollar made its economy perpetually exposed. Over the next several years, Iran experimented with barter arrangements, local currency trade with partners such as Russia and China, and even early cryptocurrency channels, reducing vulnerability long before the next round of sanctions hit in 2018. The cutoff of Russia in 2022, however, was an entirely different magnitude. Russia was not a small energy exporter with limited financial ties. It was the 11th largest economy in the world, a major nuclear state, a central player in global energy markets, and a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. For the first time, the United States demonstrated willingness to exclude a top-tier global power from the core financial infrastructure of the modern world. The intended message to Moscow was forceful, but the unintended message to the rest of the world was even louder. Any country that found itself in political disagreement with Washington could suffer the same fate. That possibility triggered a strategic reassessment in non-Western capitals. The choice was stark: remain structurally dependent on a financial system controlled by the United States, or rapidly diversify. Many chose the latter. Historical precedent shows why. In 1914, when Britain still ruled global finance, London froze German assets across the British Empire. This gave Britain temporary leverage during World War I, but it also frightened neutral countries who suddenly realized their wealth in London could be seized. They moved reserves into New York, Paris, and gold, slowly draining London's dominance until the dollar replaced the pound by 1944. The United States repeated a similar pattern in 1979 when Iranian assets were frozen after the Tehran hostage crisis. Although intended to punish Iran, it unsettled OPEC members who understood that their enormous dollar holdings were no longer untouchable. Over the following decade, many Gulf states diversified into European currencies and gold, beginning a slow erosion of the dollar's absolute supremacy. A third iteration arrived in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. Washington imposed targeted sanctions but did not remove Moscow from SWIFT. That partial strike inadvertently gave Russia 8 full years to reconfigure its financial system, slash dollar holdings, accumulate gold reserves, create its own messaging platform called SPFS, and negotiate non-dollar trade arrangements with China, India, and others. By the time full-scale sanctions arrived in 2022, Russia had already reinforced the walls. The fourth and most consequential use of financial weaponry occurred on February 26, 2022. Russian banks were removed from SWIFT, and roughly $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves held in Western institutions were frozen. The initial shock was dramatic. The ruble plunged, markets halted, and analysts proclaimed imminent economic collapse. But Russia rapidly implemented emergency interest rate hikes, capital controls, and mandatory ruble settlement for energy exports. The currency rebounded within months. Meanwhile, trade flows realigned toward Asia and the Middle East, transacted increasingly in yuan, rupees, and dirhams. The short-term pain for Russia was real, but survivable. The long-term damage, however, was to the credibility of the dollar-centric system itself. Governments across Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and Asia realized that reserves stored in the United States or Europe were not sacrosanct. They were political assets that could be frozen instantly. That recognition triggered the 5-step cascade that always follows financial weaponization. First, the hegemon controls the system. Second, it deploys that system as a weapon. Third, the sanctioned state builds replacements. Fourth, neutral countries quietly hedge their exposure. And finally, the original weapon loses much of its power. The world is unmistakably moving through steps 4 and 5 today. The data proves it. China's treasury holdings falling from $1.3 trillion a decade ago to under $800 billion. Russia conducting nearly 40% of foreign trade outside the dollar and euro by 2024. The yuan and ruble becoming dominant in Russia. China commerce exceeding $240 billion. Central banks purchasing over 1,000 tons of gold annually for 3 consecutive years. Saudi Arabia agreeing in 2023 to accept yuan for oil shipments to China, breaking a half-century petrodollar tradition. BRICS expanding from 5 to 9 states including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, and China's CIPS more than doubling annual transaction volume to roughly $27 trillion by 2023. All of these shifts represent the world preparing for a future in which the dollar is no longer the single, unavoidable currency of global trade. The consequences for the United States are profound and unfolding in real time. The erosion of dollar supremacy does not arrive through sudden collapse. It unfolds through cumulative decisions made by hundreds of governments and financial institutions that no longer wish to operate under a structure where their national reserves can be frozen by a political decree. As more countries diversify their holdings and trade settlement currencies, the dollar's network effects weaken, and once that momentum shifts, it almost never reverses. This mirrors the slow decline of the British pound after 1914. London remained influential for decades, but the psychological break had already occurred, and the world gradually reorganized itself around New York. The United States is now experiencing the same phenomenon in accelerated form because digital systems allow alternative networks to scale far faster than their predecessors. What took decades in the early 20th century can be accomplished in years today. China's cross-border interbank payment system is the clearest example. In 2020, CIPS handled roughly $12 trillion of annual transactions. By 2023, it processed more than 27 trillion. It now links over 1,400 banks in more than 100 countries, providing a functioning non-Western settlement rail for yuan-denominated commerce. Russia's SPFS, while more limited domestically, integrates with SIPS and expands yearly. India's Unified Payments Interface conducts billions of cross-border and domestic transfers and is quietly evolving into a broader settlement platform. Brazil, South Africa, and Southeast Asian nations are developing regional systems that reduce reliance on Western intermediaries. These systems collectively create a world in which countries have credible alternatives for settling trade without passing through New York or Brussels. Central banks recognize the shift and are repositioning rapidly. Gold purchases exceeding 1,000 tons per year for 3 consecutive years signal a deliberate retreat from dollar exposure. Nations accumulating gold, China, Russia, Turkey, India, Singapore, Poland, and others, are preparing for a future monetary environment in which physical metal becomes a neutral anchor amid weakening trust in Western financial governance. Gold cannot be frozen, seized, or weaponized. That singular property makes it attractive to any country that witnessed the $300 billion of Russian reserves evaporate overnight. Equally significant is the restructuring of energy trade. For 50 years, the petrodollar system ensured that nearly all global oil transactions were invoiced in dollars. This created perpetual demand for the United States currency regardless of underlying economic performance. But in 2023, Saudi Arabia accepted yuan for oil shipments to China, ending a monopoly that had underpinned American financial dominance for half a century. The United Arab Emirates now settles trade with India in rupees and dirhams. Iran accepts yuan for energy. Russia sells oil to India in rupees. Iraq is negotiating yuan settlement mechanisms. The energy world is becoming currency agnostic. And once the monopoly of dollar-only oil pricing collapses, the structural demand that sustained dollar supremacy weakens irreversibly. BRICS expansion accelerates this transformation. With Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia now included, the expanded 9-member BRICS group represents nearly half of humanity, more than 1/3 of global GDP, and roughly 40% of the world's oil production. These nations openly discuss a commodity-anchored trade unit that would complement their existing currencies and provide a neutral alternative for international settlement. Whether such a unit emerges in the near term or evolves gradually, the political intention is unmistakable. Create an ecosystem in which the dollar is optional, not mandatory. The timeline implied by these developments aligns with historical precedent. Britain weaponized finance in 1914 and relinquished reserve currency status by 1944, a span of 30 years. The United States weaponized SWIFT and froze reserves in 2022. Applying the same trajectory implies the dollar transitions from dominant to merely primary between approximately 2037 and 2047. But because today's world is digitally interconnected and alternative infrastructures already exist, the shift may progress more rapidly. Dollar reserve share has already fallen from 71% in 1999 to roughly 58% today. That 13 percentage point decline took 25 years, but the pace is accelerating. 4 percentage points disappeared in just the past 2 years. If that rate continues or increases, the dollar could fall below 50% before the end of this decade and approach 40% by the mid-2030s. In a multipolar reserve structure, the dollar does not vanish. It simply loses its unique privilege. It becomes one currency among several, competing with the euro, the yuan, and a potential commodity-linked BRICS unit for global usage. The consequences for the United States economy are immense. For decades, the country has financed enormous trade deficits, around $800 billion annually, by issuing dollar assets that foreign nations were compelled to buy to maintain reserves. This exorbitant privilege allowed Americans to consume more than they produced and pay for imports with currency created at minimal cost. Once dollar demand falls, this model collapses. Foreign appetite for United States Treasury's contracts, pushing interest rates higher. The government cannot sustain multi-trillion-dollar annual deficits without triggering domestic inflation. Borrowing costs rise not only for the state, but for businesses and households. The United States must either reduce spending dramatically, raise taxes, or accept persistent inflation that erodes purchasing power. Living standards adjust downward as the economy rebalances toward what it can produce rather than what it can borrow. Meanwhile, countries positioned outside the dollar structure gain flexibility and leverage. China stands to benefit the most. Its vast manufacturing base, expanding financial footprint, rapidly growing CIPS network, rising gold reserves, and deep trade integration equip it to become the central node in a post-dollar system. Beijing does not need to replace the dollar entirely. It simply must offer a stable alternative that enough countries adopt. Russia also gains strategically. By demonstrating that a major nation can survive ejection from SWIFT, Moscow inadvertently proved that United States financial power has limits. This emboldens middle powers such as India, Brazil, Indonesia, and Turkey to chart more independent courses in foreign policy, choosing trade terms and currency arrangements that benefit them rather than automatically aligning with Washington. Gold also emerges as a major winner. As trust in politically controlled reserve instruments declines, gold's role as a neutral settlement asset grows. Central bank accumulation signals a reversion to historical norms where gold served as the underlying stabilizer in global finance. The losers in this transition are equally clear. The United States loses its monopoly over global finance, which translates into diminished strategic leverage, rising borrowing costs, and ultimately a reduced ability to project power internationally. Europe, tied closely to United States systems and having followed Washington's lead in sanctions, finds itself squeezed between an ascendant China and a fiscally constrained America. SWIFT itself becomes less central as countries migrate to regional or national systems that bypass Western control. Holders of dollar-denominated assets lose purchasing power as persistent inflation and currency devaluation erode value. American consumers accustomed to cheap imports financed by dollar privilege face steadily rising prices. All of this follows a logic as old as empires. Financial dominance rests on trust, and trust evaporates when the dominant power weaponizes the very system it claims to safeguard. February 26, 2022 will likely be remembered not as the moment the West crippled Russia, but as the moment the world realized it needed independence from the United States financial architecture. The dollar's decline will not be sudden or theatrical. It will be methodical, cumulative, and ultimately irreversible. The United States did not lose dominance because a rival defeated it. It lost dominance because it used its greatest advantage as a weapon, and by doing so taught the world to build systems in which that advantage no longer applies. When historians examine the early 21st century, they will point to the SWIFT cutoff as the turning point, the day the post-dollar world began taking shape, even if few recognized it at the time.